going to talk a little bit about missions in the church. Because as a church, we have a responsibility to support other Christians, other churches, other ministries, other missionaries that are out there in our world, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ and doing their best to serve our community and other communities around the country. There are many groups out there that depend on the financial support of multiple churches. The purpose of missions is to help us, to help them, to meet those needs. The reason that the church must be part of missions is because it helps all of the members of the church to feel included in helping other Christians. Because when we think about it, while many Christians should tithe, and we do, give offerings to the church, there's many that's all they can afford to give. They can afford to give a little extra here and there to help different missions. And one of our members actually pulled me aside one time and talked to me about this, and kind of relayed the message that I wish I could, but I can't. But if the church does, and I give to the church, it makes me feel included in helping with these other ministries that are out there. And I told him, I said, well, that's a good way to look at it. It's a good way for you to feel included because the church does support missions. So you support the church, in turn the church supports different ministries. You can feel included. That kind of helped ease his mind a little bit, but like I said, we can't all afford to give a little bit more to help a ministry. So the church can step in and use part of the tithes and the offerings that we're given to help these different ministries. Of course, these can include local ministries, like the Community Outreach Center that we support, and ministries in other countries. There are many different ministries that need support, and one church most likely can't meet all of the needs of that ministry. But many churches working together can help supply those needs. Many churches working together can help multiple ministries and help us to do what God tells us to do, what Jesus told us to do, and to go and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Robert Morgan said, give is an act of worship. Honor the Lord with your money and with the first fruits of all of your income. 2 little boys were each given a box of chocolates by their grandfather. The first boy took the package into his room, tore it open, and as kids would do, stuffed candies into his mouth until he was one big mess of smeared chocolate. The other little boy, however, unwrapped his package in front of his grandfather. He opened the box and looked at all the candies. Then he raised the box to his grandfather and said, thank you for giving me this candy. Here, you have the first piece. Much like the second little boy, as individual Christians, that's what we should do. We should give to God our first piece. But not only that, the church is told to do the same thing as well. This morning what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the church in Corinth and how they were compelled to give to the church in Jerusalem, but somewhere along the lines they got sidetracked. So before we get into it, let's set the stage. Where were these churches at? What happened? Well, about a year prior to his writing of the letter of 2 Corinthians, Paul had sent Titus to the church in Corinth with his first letter that we have is 1 Corinthians. And while Titus was there, he, through Paul, appealed to this church to help the financially struggling Christian church in Jerusalem. Of course, you can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, where it was also included in Paul's letter. But because this was a wealthy church, so they lived in one of the most wealthiest cities of the Roman Empire, the church promised to collect a large amount of money for the church in Jerusalem, but for whatever reason they stopped collecting. They got sidetracked. Something else got their attention. So now here, a year later, Paul is sending another letter to the church to remind them to fulfill their commitment. And he reminded them that a giving church is an example for all believers. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, we read, "And now, brothers, I want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints, and they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will." And Paul began this part of his letter by telling the Corinthian church about what a group of churches in Macedonia had done. These churches were very poor, but they urgently pleaded with Paul and his companions to allow them to participate in helping this church in Jerusalem. Paul knew that these churches were struggling financially themselves, yet they wanted to give to their fellow Christians, and they gave freely. Knowing their financial abilities, Paul didn't expect that much. But he was taken by surprise at how much they gave. Not only did they collect what he expected, but they went beyond what they could afford. Not only did they go above in their collecting for the church in Jerusalem, but they even collected some money to help Paul in his travels. So Paul gave them one ministry to support, and they decided to support two. Paul praised the churches in Macedonia, but gave God the glory in order to show the Corinthian church the example of how God blessed a giving church, and how a giving church is an example to other churches. In much the same way, the churches in Macedonia can be an example to us as well. The church in Jerusalem, they were struggling because they'd been ousted by the Jews, and they weren't able to find much work. They could barely support their own families, much less the church. So Paul went to these Gentile churches and asked, "Will you support your Christian brothers and sisters in Jerusalem?" And they did. They set an example for other churches. There are many ministries, as I said, today that need financial support. Now, Paul understood, and I understand, and I hope you understand, that we can't afford to support all the missions and missionaries and ministries that are out there. It's impossible. There's so many legitimate ministries that are out there in our community, as well as in our state, in our country, and in the world, that there's no way that every church could support every ministry. But as I said, with the church in Macedonia, Paul gave them one ministry to support, and they chose another. They added to what they were asked to do, and that's an example to us. We need to be willing to give to some ministries that need our support. And as a result of the churches in Macedonia's willingness to give, they became an example that we have in the Bible for all churches. If we follow their example, we're going to set an example for other churches in our community. By setting the example, we'll follow God's will for our church, because it's God's will that we be a giving church. Continuing in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 6 through 12, it says, "So we urge Titus, since he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also completion to the act of grace on your part. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see to it that you also excel in the grace of giving. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it to the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And here is my advice about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first, not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your means." And I want you to pay close attention to verse 12. It says, "For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what he does not have." As I said, Titus had taken the first letter to the church in Corinth. Titus had gotten their commitment to help the church in Jerusalem. They passed the good news on to Paul. But here we were a year later. Nothing. So Paul sent another letter through Titus and encouraged him to encourage the church to fulfill their promise. He reminds the church in Corinth that they excel in many of the spiritual gifts. And then he listed them. He listed gifts, faith, speech, knowledge, and love. He wanted them to excel in the gift of giving as well. He also reminded him, as he reminds us, that it's not a command. He's not commanding the church to give to the church in Jerusalem. He's not commanding us to give to other ministries, but he wants us, and he wanted them to remember their commitment. He reminded them how the Macedonian churches gave, and he compared it to their giving. Well, the Macedonian churches went above and beyond what they pledged. Here the church in Corinth had given very little to nothing of what they had pledged. But Paul, he went a little step beyond what you might think. He said that it's a test of sincere love. Keeping your commitments, making commitments to give, to support, to help other ministries is a test of love. What Paul is asking, he's asking, do you love your fellow Christians? Do you love them enough to be willing to help support their ministries? Do you love them enough to sacrifice from your wealth to help in their struggles? What he's asking is it an example of our love? He reminds us that a church that's not willing to support another church or another ministry is not a loving church. And he reminds us of the greatest love that we were ever shown. He reminds us how Jesus, who riches beyond understanding, the riches of heaven, when you read John's illustration of the description of heaven in the book of Revelation, he used only words that he could understand, that we would understand, but the beauty and the glory of heaven was beyond words. Paul reminds us that Jesus gave all that up. And he came down, he was born in the humblest of circumstances. He was born in a cave where animals slept. He was born to a poor family. He grew up in a poor family. And then he went to the cross and gave his life so that we can become rich. Not necessarily rich in this lifetime, although some would like to have us think so. The more you give, the more God will give. While that is true, that's not what Jesus gave his life for. He gave his life so that we would experience the riches of heaven. The riches of being in the presence of the Creator. Jesus gave all that up. Came down to be one of us. To set an example for us in giving. Because Christ did this, Paul reminds the church in Corinth that they should be willing to give of their wealth to help the less fortunate. And so should we. Paul then turned his attention to the gift itself. Instead of asking for a certain amount, Paul said that it's the attitude of the gift that mattered. It's the heart of the gift that Jesus is looking at. He's not looking at the amount. He said that we should give according to our means, not according to what we don't have. It's our willingness to give that's important. It's a willingness to give that God is looking at. Giving is important, but not giving is not a good option. Again, as I said, we can't give to every ministry that's out there, but we can give to some. Paul reminds us of something else that God did. That God blessed the Israelites. We're going to talk about that now. Because when we give, not only does it bless others, but it blesses us as well. And in 2 Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 13 through 15, it says, our desire is not that others might not be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time you have plenty. Your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. Then there will be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. So here Paul is telling us that we don't need to give to the point to where we get ourselves in trouble. We don't need to give so much to another ministry that we begin to struggle. Again, Paul had a specific ministry that he was talking about. And he knew that this church in Corinth was a very wealthy church and that they could help support the church in Jerusalem. Same things for us. We need to be able to give from our wealth to help other ministries to meet their needs. Paul knew that the roles one day could be reversed. That the church in Corinth would find themselves in a lot of trouble spiritually because they lived in a very, very wealthy but very wicked city. So while they could give financially to the church in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem could give back spiritually to them. When they found themselves in battles spiritually with the sin that was going on around them, they could lean on the church in Jerusalem to help them give spiritual support. But again, Paul reminds us of what the Israelites went through and how God provided for them in the desert. He said that those that gathered much had enough to meet their needs, but those that gathered little still had enough to meet their needs. And Paul's reasoning for mentioning this is that God wants the needs of all of His people to be met, of all of His ministries, all of His churches to be met. And now, while God could miraculously make that happen, as He did with the Israelites in the desert, He wants us to demonstrate our love through helping other Christians and other ministries meet their needs. This is a way for us to demonstrate our love for our fellow Christians, as well as a way for us to demonstrate our love for Jesus Christ and what He has done for us. Because there might be one day where we have to lean on another church or another ministry to help us to get through a fight that we're going through. Paul tells us that a giving church is a loving church. A giving church is an example to other churches. A giving church is a church that's willing to follow Christ's example. A giving church is a church that wants to see the gospel of Christ spread in parts of the world that we could never reach. I want to share with you an example of how this works. Another ministry that I'm a part of, that many of you have heard me speak about, and many of you even met several members of our organization, the Christian Motorcyclists Association. There's been several of them that you've seen their love and support through me back when we were living in Jonesboro. They had to bring me down here because when Cindy was pregnant and other health issues and stuff like that. So you saw how many of them have touched and blessed my life through their willingness to give. But let me tell you a little story of how CMA has worked. Since 1975, they've been doing a once-a-year fundraiser called Run for the Sun. They have collected over $63 million. How does this work? Well, it's broken down like this. We give 20% to Open Doors Ministry, which is a ministry that translates and passes out Bibles around the world. 20% goes to Missionary Ventures, which is a ministry that provides motorcycles and other transportation vehicles to pastors and evangelists in third world countries. I think we've even given away a camel. But several boats, hundreds of motorcycles, a couple boats, a horse, quite a few bicycles, and I believe that we did give a camel away a few years ago. Whatever is needed is what this ministry does to help these pastors get from town to town, from city to city. Because a lot of pastors in these third world countries, they pastor multiple churches. They plant multiple churches. Then 20% we give to the Jesus Film Project, which is a ministry that translates and helps to show the Jesus film around the world. Sometimes they even have to carry the projector and the screen and a generator on their back to get it from one village to another village. A lot of these villages don't have electricity. And then 40% goes to reach the motorcycling community. CMA has a presence in 192 of 196 known countries in the world. The 4 countries that we're not in are countries that have very strict rules against Christianity. And through these years, 22.5 million people have given their lives to Christ. For every $2.50 that's given, someone has heard and accepted the gospel. For every dollar that's given, one person has heard the gospel. This is just an example of how many people in many churches can work together to financially support a ministry and spread the gospel around the world. It's an example of how one ministry should use its money to support other ministries. Can one small church reach 22.5 million people? It's impossible. Can a big church can't even reach that many people. But through financially supporting other ministries and other missions, we, along with many other churches and individual Christians, can have a major impact for the gospel of Christ in our community and around the world. And isn't that why we're here in the first place? Jesus said, go into all of the world. Well, it's kind of hard for 40 to 50 people to go into all the world. If you remember, Jesus selected 12 men, one of which betrayed him. So they brought another one in, and then he selected Paul. So 13 men began this journey. Millions of people have given their lives because of the efforts of 13 men. How many more will give their lives to Christ because of the effort of 40 to 50 members of a small church? Together we can make a difference with other churches, with other ministries. How much do we love God? How much do we want His gospel shared where we can't go?